This is Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, presented by William Campbell.
Thank you for downloading episode 23 of Here's How. In this episode, I have a couple of speakers talking about the legal implications of flooding and how they can be managed, and I'll discuss its connection with planning corruption.
Here's How is Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast. Make your view heard. Just dial 076 603 5060 and tell the world what you're thinking. Your voicemail may be included in the next podcast. You can find tips on recording your contribution and other ways to contact the show at here'show.ie/call.
There were two big stories in the news recently. The sting by RT's primetime against corrupt councillors looking for bribes in one way or another, and the bad weather with the resulting floods. You might think that these are two totally separate stories, but they're not. In fact, not only are they linked, you could say that they're the same story. Now, Hugh McElvaney...
I want loads of money.
Yes, that guy, Hugh McElvaney, was caught on camera demanding bribes from an undercover reporter that he thought was a wind farm developer. He's been a Fine Gael county councillor in Monaghan since 1999. He resigned from the Fine Gael party after the primetime sting, but not from the council. He's still sitting on the council now as an independent. It's not the first time that this crook has starred in a primetime programme. In 2007, Primetime investigated planning in various local authorities, including Monaghan. Fine Gael councillors, led by McElvaney from 2009 onwards, when he was made the chief whip of the Fine Gael group on the council, they were rezoning land at an astonishing rate. Over a few years, they zoned more housing units to be built than the entire population of Monaghan. That's not to say there would be more houses than people in Monaghan. If they were built, there would be more new houses than the total amount of people in the county. In total, they zoned enough housing for about 4 times the population of the county. Needless to say, a large chunk of the ones that were actually built have ended up as ghost estates. And, of course, a large chunk of what they rezoned was floodplains. Now, why would Hugh Loads of Money McElvaney rezone so much land? Why would he rezone floodplains? When he was asked, he said that the houses could be built on stilts. When he was Minister for the Environment, John Gormley wanted a better answer, and he ordered inquiries into planning irregularities in Monaghan, as well as Waterford, Carlow, Dublin and Donegal. McElvaney said of Gormley, "He's only in a wet week and he came in and robbed us." But McElvaney was rescued when his Fine Gael party colleague Phil Hogan took over as Environment Minister. Hogan, immediately on taking office, cancelled all the inquiries. A couple of Fine Gael politicians were in the media saying good riddance to their former colleague McElvaney, but they didn't have anything to say about Hogan. And they didn't have anything to say about the fact that the current Fine Gael-led government has left the Standards in Public Office Commission as a toothless, sclerotic, hidebound office. In particular, the Commission can't take any decisions unless all members of the Commission are present, so it's paralysed unless all 6 members can find a common date in their diary. For periods, the government hasn't even reappointed members when a vacancy arises, so nothing can proceed. It's no wonder that the few investigations that they do perform take years to complete. Another of Hugh McElvaney's party colleagues, Finance Minister Michael Noonan, made another decision to abolish the 80% windfall tax on the value of rezoning land. I'm going to talk about that after the two speakers. I've got 2 speakers lined up on the flooding and what can be done about it, but it's important to remember how corrupt planning causes floods in 2 specific ways. Firstly, obviously, zoning floodplains for housing means that those houses will get flooded. It's blindingly obvious that councils around the country have based zoning decisions on making the right people rich, not on building housing in the right place. Secondly, concreting over the wrong places can mean that land can't soak up water in the way that has happened traditionally, and that can move floods to areas that were previously safe for houses. I'll talk about solutions after the speakers.
If you like the Here's How podcast, please rate and review the show on iTunes and other podcast providers. Share it on Facebook and Twitter. Tell your friends. But most of all, make your views heard. Call us on 076 603 5060.
On the line, I have Sinead Carroll of Cantillon Solicitors. She's a solicitor who's an expert in this area. Sinead, there's been a lot of talk about people suing because they got their house flooded. Can you do that? Is the government responsible just because you got your house flooded?
The short answer is no. It's when you look at the possibility of bringing a claim arising from flooding, it can lead us to what I'd call an exotic area of the law. There's lots of things to be considered, and unfortunately, because so many people are without insurance now, they are coming to us and seeking legal advice about what other recourse they may have.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're considering the question, you have a couple of bodies or people to consider, really. You have the Office of Public Works, the OPW, you may have the various councils, but also you actually might have the developers in various housing estates. And maybe if I touch on the last option first, certain people have raised the question that their houses, for example, would have been built on floodplains. And then the question is, well, whether the planning should have been given in the first place, and if not, does that entitle you to sue the state because your house was built in a floodplain, you've suffered extensive damage now, can you sue?
Mm-hmm.
And my own feeling on that is no. I don't think that the granting of the permission itself and your house being built upon a floodplain is going to entitle you to automatically sue.
Mm-hmm.
But all may not be lost. One might then consider the developer.
Yeah.
So it needs investigation. You might well have a situation where the planning permission may have been granted, but let's say various systems were meant to have been put in place to properly manage the water that weren't put in place. So that might open up a cause of action against the developer. You just have to do the investigations and see. So it's not the case, in my view, that the developer could turn around and say, well, you can't come after me. We got planning for the place.
Mm-hmm.
The council allowed us to sue here. I don't think that will get them off the hook, but equally, it's not an automatic thing. One would have to see, was it adequately designed and proper measures put in place.
I understand. And what happens if, say, for example, a floodplain has been concreted over in order to build a housing estate, and that has moved the flood into a different area that would not normally have been flooded? Yeah,
I mean, again, I suppose what the kind of area of law that we're getting into, without getting too technical about it, but just to give you some idea and your listeners some idea, it's called nuisance.
Mm-hmm.
And what nuisance means is that it's the interference with another person in the exercise of their rights over their property. So it's basically an unreasonable interference with your property rights.
Mm-hmm. So that would be like the moving the flood to somebody else's land.
Yeah,
could be
an escape of water would be an interference. So when we're assessing the law in all of this, we go to the law of nuisance. In terms of kind of the example that you give, I think, again, it depends, because was it a proper and reasonable thing to have been done, whatever action was done, the concreting over or whatever it was. So it goes back to proper management, proper design. Was any of that done improperly or unreasonably? And then you might have a cause of action. It's a tricky area, and there's no automatic, there's no yes or no, there's no yes answer, I suppose I should say, as for an automatic entitlement.
I understand. I think everybody will have seen at this stage Councillor Hugh McElvaney, formerly of Fine Gael, now an independent, boasting about how much money he would demand from what he thought was a wind farm developer. But it's been pointed out that he was one of the leading councillors responsible for rezoning huge areas of Monaghan. I think the calculation was you could quadruple the population of Monaghan with the amount of rezoning that was done during the boom. It was when it was put to him, long before he was involved in this particular controversy, when it was put to him that he had rezoned places that were floodplains, he said, sure, they could build their houses on stilts. If it could be shown, I'm not accusing anybody of anything, but if it could be shown that the rezoning had been influenced by bribery and corruption, could that be a cause for action?
Again, I'm not sure, if I'm being perfectly honest. I mean, I think that's getting into a different area of law completely. I think, again, it would just go back to the issue of whether the house should have been built there in the first place, which is the planning issue that I mentioned a few moments ago. Mm-hmm. And I felt that in itself isn't going to attach a liability, even if one might have the opinion, and obviously I'm not giving any view on it, but if there was a view out there that the planning was given as a result of whatever you just said, bribery, etc., I don't think that's an automatic entitlement, no.
One last point. It's been proposed by several people, myself included, that when you're looking for planning permission, you should be required to provide evidence that an insurance company is willing to provide 25 years flood insurance, and that you have to buy that when you build the house. Do you think that would be legally feasible?
In terms of it being a condition, I mean, the planners, they can put conditions on the grant of planning permission. So, I mean, I think it's something that they can certainly consider. 25 years, I'm not sure, if I'm being perfectly honest. It's possible. It's possible, I suppose.
Okay. Sinead Carroll of Cantillon Solicitors in Cork, thank you very much for talking to me.
Thanks so much.
If you liked the Here's How podcast, please rate and review the show on iTunes and other podcast providers. Share it on Facebook and Twitter. Tell your friends. But most of all, make your views heard. Call us on 076 603 5060.
On the line now is Jason O'Sullivan. He is the principal and founder of JOS Solicitors. Jason, you were writing in the Irish Independent a short while ago arguing for a government-backed insurance scheme for people who couldn't get flood insurance. Can you explain why you think that's a good idea?
Yeah, it's an issue which clients have raised to me, and I suppose I'm doing a bit of research in it as well. You know, given the problems with climate change, it's an issue, I think, which needs to be addressed by government. I suppose I'm making it comparable with what's occurring in the UK at the moment. They have, since 2011, they negotiated with the insurance industry and have come up with, it's a reinsurance scheme called Flood Re. Mm-hmm. And so it's essentially a fund that provides affordable flood cover to high-risk properties in areas where there's a likelihood of floods, and it's based on a levy which all householders pay. At the moment, it's estimated to be about £10.50, which equates to about €15. It actually hasn't commenced yet in the UK. It's to start in April next year. But it tries to address a real problem which is occurring in Ireland. So it's as I said, it's yet to be tested, but I think it's something that the Irish government and insurance industry need to address and need to take serious.
I suppose one basic question about it is this something that you would anticipate that would be available only to currently existing properties, or that it would be available to people going forward who build new builds? Yeah,
I think what's the way in the UK what's going to happen, and I suppose in Ireland as well, because when I was doing the research on this, I was quite surprised that there hadn't been much articles or literature on Flood Re on comparable with an Irish basis. The last thing which was done was Michael Noonan had been our minister Noonan had been asked a question in the Dáil about it, and he kind of given an indication that they might look into it in the future, but that they were currently presiding over the current policy.
Mm-hmm. The reason I ask is because it strikes me there's a problem with moral hazard there. If I have a floodplain, or if perhaps I'm a Monaghan County councillor who's tempted by whatever means to rezone a floodplain as housing, am I then able to impose that risk on everybody else in society?
Yeah, well, the way the scheme works is that, that every household will be paying maybe an extra premium on this. It has to be costed yet. But I suppose if you look at it, with the 50 million, or which has been proposed by government anyway, people are already paying a cost in relation to their taxes. And this has been done before as well in relation to the collapse of Quinn. So currently, every person that is paying insurance is paying an extra 2% on their policies for that.
Yeah, but do you see what I mean? Do you see what I mean? That was to cope with a situation that had arisen. This is something that has potential to change future behaviour. It would make somebody perhaps who was reluctant to build on a floodplain because they thought their house would be flooded or they wouldn't be able to sell it if they were a developer. They can now say, oh, sure, it doesn't matter. This flood re will cover it.
No, I don't think that would be the way it would work. It'd be more so, I suppose, and that's probably one of the problems with insurance at the moment is that, and it's one of the problems was that there was such poor planning done, and there shouldn't have been houses built on floodplains. I think with new legislation that was brought in recently, it's increased slightly the surveillance by architects on the final plans, so I think it'd be more difficult now for any builder to build near a floodplain. So this really isn't a view to, enabling for builders to build willy-nilly on bad land. It's more to do with those people who have suffered from, in 2009 and now also, and that are likely that they're going to suffer continuously. I suppose it was coming from the climate change conference last week was that, where these events of 100-year floods are more likely now to be maybe every 10 years. Mm-hmm. So it's a real serious problem that government has to face up to. I think I don't foresee that there's going to be less scrutiny. I think there'll be probably more scrutiny in relation to building. Some arguments against flood re has been that, well, why should people not living near flood areas have to pay? But the way climate change is occurring, people are increasingly going to be near or high risk of flood areas because those areas are going to expand. Also, if people that have a property there that has been flooded, they won't be able to sell that property, and also purchasers won't be able to get the necessary mortgage if they can't get insurance. So it's going to be even a bigger problem coming down the line, I think, because more properties will be at risk. For example, in 2009, there was a lot of properties, areas for Moy, Clonmel, Mallow. They all got defence schemes, flood defence schemes put in. So, and they've actually been okay for this period. But there's new areas such as Corbally, which didn't, I think, suffer in 2009, but they're actually suffering this time with flood problems. So it is an increasing issue.
Do you think it might be the case that some properties will have to be abandoned because, as you say, they are likely to be flooded so frequently?
Yeah, possibly. I saw reference to there was one environmentalist saying that in some areas that possibly people there'll be no matter what flood defence will go up, it's still not going to be cost effective. So maybe those people will have to be moved. Yeah, and that's very likely.
Jason O'Sullivan, founder of JOS Solicitors, thank you very much for talking to me.
Thank you, William.
Never miss a show. Follow at Here's How Podcast on Twitter and like Here's How on Facebook for updates on each show's contents.
I have to say that I disagree with Jason O'Sullivan's suggestion, particularly if it's to apply to houses built now or in the future. Jason O'Sullivan is a solicitor. I'm sure he knows a lot more about his areas of expertise, the law, than I do. but I think that we have to take into account economics and the market when we design public policy. The bottom line is that behaviour that is rewarded will be repeated. If you reward someone who builds their house on a floodplain by telling them that every time they get flooded, the taxpayer will reward them by paying for all of their repairs, then people will have a strong incentive to keep building on floodplains. Now, there may be some good reasons to compensate people who unknowingly bought houses that were built on floodplains. And for sure, if somebody's house is getting flooded now because a flood was moved by inappropriate building elsewhere, then they have a good case for compensation. But that compensation bill should not be landed on the taxpayer or as a levy on home insurance. It should be sent to the county councils who zoned for inappropriate building. Loads of Money McElvaney boasted how he expected to top the poll in the next elections as well. I'm sad to say I think he might be right, but I think the voters in Clonus might think twice before electing him if that compensation was taken out of their property tax or local services. The next solution, as I mentioned to Sinead Carroll, is to require anyone building a house to buy 25 years flood insurance for the property before they get planning permission. Ireland is a small country with small towns. Applicants are often the neighbours of planning officials, and decisions can be influenced by this. But insurance companies are going to look long and hard at the flood risk before they price that sort of flood insurance. And if they won't take the business at a reasonable price, or at all, then that's a very good indication that you shouldn't be building on that site. This would take the pressure off councils. They needn't worry about assessing the flood risk at all. Finally, the windfall tax that was abolished by Fine Gael Finance Minister Michael Noonan. Now, in general, I'm in favour of lower taxation. People who use their talent, skill and hard work should be allowed to keep as much of the fruits of their labour as possible. But getting your land rezoned is not the fruit of talent, skill or hard work. People can become hugely rich just by being lucky enough to own farmland that gets rezoned for housing. There's no wealth created here. It's just the enrichment of people who get to jump the queue. The value only exists because other people don't get the same permission to build that you get, creating artificial scarcity. Councillors and council officials can, at the stroke of a pen, make someone a multimillionaire. It is hopelessly naive to think that with people like Hugh McElvaney making the decisions, those millions won't circle back around and influence the decision as to what gets rezoned. That is how floodplains get zoned for housing. The windfall tax on zoning should not be 80%. That value belongs to the state, to the taxpayer. None of it is generated by land speculators. And until we have a system where all of the value of rezoning goes to the state, then we will have chronic planning corruption.
Do you agree? Do you disagree? If you want your point of view heard, dial 076 603 5060 and leave a contribution for the show. The lines are open 24/7 and you can find tips on how to record a good contribution and other ways to contact the podcast at here'show.ie/call.
And that's almost the end of episode 23 of Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, published on the 18th of December 2015. References for everything that I mentioned in the show are listed in this episode's page on the here'show.ie website. If you can think of a topic or want to suggest someone to include, and that could be you, then let me know. If you like the podcast, please go on iTunes and write a nice review. Also, please like the show on Facebook. Please follow @Here's How Podcast on Twitter. And of course, subscribe to the show. You can use iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn Radio, or any other podcast app or software. You can do all of that, or get in touch with the show right from www.here'show.ie. or you could go out to a Christmas party and tell your friends all about the podcast. The next show will be uploaded shortly. The Here's How podcast is produced and presented by me, William Campbell. Thank you for listening.